Well, hello, this is Dr. J. Smith. And as you can see, I have got a friend on, I'm not sure which side he is on, but he is from far, far away, way over in Britain. And he and I have worked together at a place called Speaker's Corner. Chris is, in fact, he is known as Chris from Speaker's Corner or Chris of Speaker's Corner. And that is actually the name of his YouTube site. Chris was has been going down there, I think, to Speaker's Corner for about 3 years. So he is not a novice. He is actually well initiated to the cut and parry of Speaker's Corner and all the difficulties that come out there. He has been a Christian for about 17 years now. And he has been engaging on many different topics with Muslims there at Speaker's Corner, not just there face to face, but also online, and has come up with a interesting title that we're going to speak about today, looking at why Islam is collapsing, or even putting it, why is Islam collapsing? So it's even more emphatic. He believes Islam is collapsing, and there's a number of reasons. And he did this talk earlier. This is 2025. We're now in December of 2025. I was with Chris when he did this talk in June of this year, and it's got enormous amount of hits, enormous amount of people who are interested in that phrase, because most people don't know that Islam is collapsing or that is having problems. Most people are oblivious to this. Chris is right in the middle of it. He is engaging with Muslims face to face. He's engaging with Muslims online. I can't think of a better person to go and ask this question. Is Islam really collapsing, and why is it collapsing? So, Chris, welcome. Thank you for coming on board.
Thank you for having me, Jay. It's an honor to be here. Good to see you again. And yeah, let's go through why I think Islam is collapsing, and I'm going to make a positive case for this. Jay, if you could bring up the PowerPoint, I think we can start with this. So, first of all, my argument here today is that both as Christians who have an interest in bringing people to Christ, we ought to be optimistic about the future in regards to Islam, because I believe, we have good reason to believe, that Islam is collapsing as a religion, and that ultimately this is a good thing and that we can demonstrate this. Now, I want to start this off by saying, just because I'm making this case, it does not mean I think that it's easy. It doesn't mean that I think that we can just sit back and do nothing, that the church doesn't have a responsibility, that we can't improve, none of that at all. I am simply saying, if the trajectory continues, things are looking very good for us as Christians regarding the state of Islam. Now, I want to jump in and make this case, and I'll do that now. So, the first thing we need to address is this idea that Islam is the fastest growing religion. People have this misconception. They think that Islam is growing at an immense rate because many people are converting to Islam. They are being convinced of the truth of Muhammad and the Quran, and they are changing religions and switching to Islam, and they are bringing their families with them, and this is happening globally. Well, that's not quite the real story. In fact, I would actually say Islam is probably one of the quickest abandoned religions in terms of people who convert and then quickly leave afterwards. And I'll bring up some statistics to back this up. Most of what occurs with Islamic growth in terms of people who are becoming Muslim is not actually through conversion. It's through two forces: immigration and just normal birth rates. In other words, Muslims are not making a convincing argument to non-Muslims, whether that's Christians, whether that's atheists, agnostics, whoever it might be. Rather, they're losing that front quite badly. They actually lose a lot of the people they do convert within a period of 5 to 10 years. And the way that they increase their numbers is just by having more kids, generally, than most of other religions, for example, but also through immigration. And this is particularly evident in the West, particularly evident in countries like the UK, France, Germany, and so on, large swathes of Europe, and America, where immigration is largely how more Muslims enter the country.
Can I just jump in real quickly on that one?
Sure.
When I was in Britain over 8 years ago, the statistic at that time is that an average British woman has 2.8 children. Don't ask me how she does, but that's the average. Muslims in Britain had 4.2, so almost double. Well, not quite double the national average, showing that they have larger families. It's primarily biological growth, even there in Britain.
Yeah, so I'm going to somewhat argue that even with an increased birth rate, that is changing rapidly, including in the UK, and the evidence bears this out. And I'm going to argue that if this continues, we'll basically see a normalcy where the average birth rate of the people who are born in the UK is going to be the same for Christian groups, Muslim groups, and potentially other groups as well. And the data kind of bears that out. So I'll move on to that as part of the presentation. But before I do, I want to show you this because it's pretty much an open secret at this point that even known amongst Muslims, even ex-Muslims, that Islam is not a particularly well-liked religion. And I don't mean by outsiders, I mean by people who actually practice it. Many people who convert to Islam after a period of between 5 to 10 years have a very high rate of leaving it. And according to an ex-Muslim, Omar Shahid, he says that out of 100,000 people in Britain that converted between 2001 and 2011, it's believed that up to 75% of them have since lost their faith. That is quite a radically high number. And this actually conforms to what we see at places like Hyde Park, at Speaker's Corner. When we engage with Muslims and ex-Muslims, we notice that a lot of them are struggling to maintain their faith and say they convert. It isn't too long before we get told that they have since left Islam. And that, of course, is something that we celebrate because we want them to come to our Lord Jesus Christ. But this is also confirmed in Muslim circles as well. You can find videos of sheikhs and imams who talk about what sometimes is referred to as the avalanche of apostasy, where there are lots of particularly young Muslims. I think the figure is around 24% of young Muslims will leave Islam just during their youth because they struggle with a lot of the aspects of Islam. And this is only going to continue. I would say the influence of the West in particular, the influence of Christianity, liberal views, and of course, through things like the internet, we're going to see more and more of this. And there isn't really a way, at least as it seems right now, to stop this. Muslims simply do not want, once they convert, they don't want to stay there. And there's practical reasons for that as well, which I'll go into here. So, for example, there's kind of a covert hierarchy. Muslim converts are not all treated the same, and this is a known issue, again, that is talked about by Muslims who have realized that depending on who you are, depending on your skin color, actually, is one metric, you will be treated very differently. So, for example, the average person on the street who is convinced to join Islam, they take their Shahada, they become Muslim, because they don't have, for example, large social influence. They aren't YouTubers, they aren't content creators, they're not celebrities, they're not any of these things, they're not movie stars. They simply are not of major concern to most da'is, to most evangelists who are spreading Islam. It's just not that important to them. They want them to take their Shahada. They often have it recorded so they can put it on YouTube and convince others to take their Shahada. But for the most part, there just isn't any reason to establish connections, to make sure they're in a mosque, to make sure that they're praying 5 times a day. It's just assumed that they will eventually do this. They'll eventually do this on their own. And because of that, they often feel isolated and they often eventually leave Islam within a matter of years. But it goes beyond that. It's not just about whether they're popular. It's also about their race, because it's been long noted, and I have my own experience of this talking to Muslims who are from their ancestry is from places in Africa, for example, and they say as a Black Muslim, they are treated very differently, particularly by Arabs. And it's something that is noticeable in their life. It's something that they find upsetting, and it's something that they constantly have to battle with. And this is also another reason why a lot of Muslim converts leave, because they are treated differently depending on either their race or their influence. So there's been an interesting response to this. Muslims have obviously realized this is happening, and da'is know that they're choosing certain groups over others. But there's now actually authors who are trying to advocate that this is actually a tactic. This is a strategy that Muslim da'is should employ intentionally in order to be most effective when giving dawah. Rather than try to deal with this as an issue of discrimination, and an issue of being very prejudiced towards people from different backgrounds, they say, no, it's actually a good thing because we can weaponize this to increase our reach as much as we possibly can. So, for example, one argument that's made, and I've given an example in this book here, The Big Step, How to Survive Islam in the Anglosphere by Mahdi Locke, he argues that, well, we simply do not have time, and Muslims are outnumbered compared to the amount of native British people in the British Isles, that it's better for them to focus their time and effort on high-profile individuals. There is no point, really, going after the average person because, A, they don't have a big platform, so they're not going to influence others that well, and B, they simply are too many, and you just don't have the resources to practically go out and give dawah to them. So this is actually something that's being encouraged by certain Muslim individuals. Now, the next point I want to make, and I think this is quite profound, and I think it's something that people often miss, is the fact that there is the population decline in the world is occurring globally. It isn't just happening in the West. People often think that because in the West populations are declining, that this is something unique just to Europe or just to North America and Europe, but rather no, it happens worldwide. When we look at places like China, when we look at South Korea, Japan, their fertility rates have plummeted to below replacement levels. And academics have long noted this, and this has been happening for at least the last 3 decades now. And the same thing is starting to happen to predominantly Muslim nations. And we can have a look at this in some data. So, for example, if we have a look at this graph, I believe this is from the World Data Organization. They have put together some statistics that show that for the United Kingdom, for example, the amount of time it took for the fertility rate to drop from the average woman having more than 6 children to having fewer than 3 took place over about 95 years. But we can look at other countries listed here, for example, Bangladesh, Iran, Turkey, Malaysia. There are other nations in which they have managed to go from such high levels of fertility, 6, 7, 8 children per couple, to actually plummeting to 3, 2, and sometimes even less than that in a radically shorter period. This to me suggests that Muslim nations are catching up with what has been affecting the Western nations for a much longer period of time. So we can see here, let's take the case of Indonesia. Indonesia has a substantial Muslim population. We can see that from 1960, they had 5.5-ish children on average. That has now plummeted to 2.1. 2.1 roughly being the replacement rate that a population has to sustain before it starts to decline. We can see Bangladesh. Bangladesh, almost as high as 7, an average of 7 children per woman as the fertility rate. That is now plummeted to 2.2 in a matter of just 50 years or so. These figures are going up to 2010. The situation has not improved since. We can see Pakistan, almost 7, again, plummeting to 3.6. Iran is significantly troubled. They have gone from 7.5-ish to now 1.7. So they are substantially under the 2.1 replacement rate needed to sustain a population. We can look at Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan, not too bad, but if we look in the last few decades, it's been a substantial decline, just like it has been in all the other examples. We've gone from 7.3-ish to now 4.8. that's likely going to continue to decline in the same way it has for other Western nations. So my argument from that is Muslim populations are decreasing. Muslim fertility rates are decreasing, which will ultimately lead to population growth declining. And when we start to see that play out in the same way that it has in the West, we're going to see a noticeable effect on things like immigration. So, for example, immigration to the West at the moment is quite substantial from Muslim populations, and this helps them establish communities in places like the UK. If we look at Tower Hamlets, if we look at Stratford, if we look at Birmingham, if we look at Bradford, if we look at Luton, they have substantial Muslim populations already. My argument is that because their fertility rate has plummeted, just like ours has, they are now playing catch up, and they're going to have the same issue. They're going to have less people, less children in the following generations, which means less immigration to places like the UK, Germany, France, and other parts of Europe, and even North America. So that's going to have a huge impact to how Islam is able to establish communities in Europe. Now let's talk about liberal influence, because we often think of liberal influence from a secular point of view. Christians who become secularized, maybe they don't practice traditions in a Christian manner. They're looking at Christmas as more commercialized as opposed to really celebrating Christmas as the birth of our Lord. Things like this happen to Christian populations, and that's well documented, but we don't really think about the effect that the liberal secular world is having on Muslim populations, particularly in the West. And we have good reason to believe that they struggle with it to the same extent, if not more, than Christians do. For example, there are many issues that mosques and imams are trying to deal with that they simply have no handle on. For example, free mixing. There are examples of men and women, Muslim men and women, who free mix. And they do it because it's very normal in a liberal society for men and women who are single to meet in public. There's no issue for it from a liberal perspective or even a Christian perspective, but there is from an Islamic one. But they have great difficulty in enforcing that because, well, how do you stop a young man and woman meeting publicly? It's very, very challenging to them. Other issues include halal. So halal as an industry in the West simply does not take it as seriously as Muslims would want them to. There is a strict code of how you enforce halal meat, that the way it has to be slaughtered, who actually engages in that slaughter, whether or not you can stun the animal beforehand, how you actually execute the animal. These are very important aspects of halal meat and how you process that. But in the West, we take a very much more relaxed attitude to this, and Muslims know this, and it doesn't seem to be an issue that's going to be resolved anytime soon. For example, it's common for many halal certifiers to simply request that a tape, for example, of the Bismillah, which is a particular phrase in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate, is spoken on a tape that plays while the normal procedure at a slaughterhouse occurs. And that is enough in a lot of certifiers to consider that as halal meat, even though that's not what any Muslims of any school of fiqh would consider sufficient. But again, they can't quite deal with this because most slaughterhouses don't want to go to the effort of bringing in actual Muslim men who are stamped with an approval to do the slaughtering process, or at least to be present there. Most slaughterhouses do stunning, which is not something that a lot of Muslims agree with as a process. So again, that shows significant liberal influence over Islamic practices. Not only that, but when we look towards the online space, when we look towards people who are influencers, people who have gravitas, they call Muslims to, they call Muslims, they call Christians and other groups to Islam, or the non-Muslims. And they do so in ways that are not particularly tactful. For example, we have the manosphere, which has a big influence on young men. People like Andrew Tate, people like the Fresh and Fit podcast, for example. These are people who are Muslim, they profess an Islamic faith, but they struggle to actually practice it. the guy who runs Fresh and Fit, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, he's been saying Merry Christmas, and he's been getting a lot of slack from other Muslims because he says that, because he's very aware he does actually have some Christians as part of his audience. Andrew Tate, likewise, he actually made the sign of the cross in a video, and Muslims are not very happy with this. Another influencer who goes by the name of Sneeko, he has had naked women behind him as he was doing recording. Many Muslims are not happy with this. But the issue is that when people think of Muslims and they think of Muslim influencers or examples of Muslims, they think of these people in the 21st century. And this is, of course, very problematic because they display very both immoral behavior from an Islamic perspective, but also from a non-Muslim perspective. And of course, this is a shift. It's a paradigm shift. There used to be actual Muslim influencers, and I sort of mean that not in the online sense, but actually just people who made speeches. They went around and they recorded content that you used to have to buy on VHS, and they would present Islam with much more tact, with much more discipline, and with much more moral behavior. But those people have fallen by the wayside. They're not as popular as these new influencers. People like Zakir Naik, Ahmed Deedat. These people used to present Islam, at least in an Islamically acceptable way. But these people do not do that because, well, they struggle to embrace Islam because it is very challenging to fully accept it. It's a very different system as opposed to a secular worldview or even a Christian worldview. And yes, I actually have a picture of you in here, Dr. J. So criticism of Islam in particular is now mainstream. It used to be the case that people could simply say that people don't ever leave Islam. It was very rare that people would know ex-Muslims because there just wasn't many ex-Muslims around. And if there was an ex-Muslim, they really didn't feel empowered to talk about it. But today, in the 21st century, that's changed, thanks to people like Dr. J and other apologists who have made cases against Islam and have spoken publicly about Islam. And people are thinking, hey, I've been told there's only one Quran. There's many Qurans. I've been told that Muhammad was a man born in Mecca, but I don't see any evidence for Mecca. I'm questioning this. And this is something that is becoming more widespread. We have different platforms like TikTok. We have YouTube. We have Instagram. These are spreading the anti-Islamic content like wildfire. And Muslims are affected by it. They have to ask their imam, their sheikh, hey, I watched a video. How do I explain this? And the imams and the sheikhs are struggling to give answers. This is something that is new, as in it's happened within the last few decades. And we're only seeing the beginning of it. I think this is going to continue and it's going to become more and more widespread, and it's going to demonstrate holes in the narrative. And this, of course, leads to another problem, intellectual fatigue. What do you do if you are an influencer, if you are a public spokesman for a religion, and you don't actually have any answers to the questions you're being asked? How do you address this? How do you go from talking about Islam, inviting people to Islam, but someone comes up to you and says, hey, I heard that Muhammad married a 9-year-old, and you just can't give a concrete answer to this, to the point where you actually start to refuse to give answers. This is something we're noticing at the moment. Muslims have been encouraged to go away from public centers of debate. So Hyde Park Speaker's Corner has a long tradition of public debate. Muslims used to be there in large numbers and dominate the area. That's changing now, and we're seeing more of them choose to not go to Speaker's Corner because intellectual fatigue is kicked in. It's getting harder and harder to defend either Muhammad or the Quran. So they're choosing to set up dawah stalls in different parts of London, for example. We're seeing Leicester Square, we're seeing Shepherd's Bush. We're seeing these areas have these big dawah stalls, and Muslims are engaging with the unexpected public, or unexpecting public. They're having to do this because they can talk to people who don't know much about Islam, and that's a lot easier than engaging with people who do know something about Islam. But again, even this is becoming challenging. The image I have on the right here is actually of a Christian apologist by the name of GodLogic. He went to a Muslim apologist by the name of Ali Dawah, and he challenged him with some very basic questions about Islam. Ali Dawah chose not to engage, even though he's on camera, even though he has many Muslims around him, and even though he is supposed to be able to have answers to these questions, he's choosing not to answer them. It wasn't because GodLogic was rude. GodLogic was, in fact, an incredibly well-mannered man. It's because it's just not worth the trouble to engage in an intellectual discussion, because too many things have come to light about Islam that it's just not worth the hassle.
Yeah. Let me come back on that real quickly. Since this is such a this is something that is we never had this when I started 40 years ago, and when I started at Speaker's Corner in 1992, there was only about 5 of us who were down there, and really I was the only one that had any Islamic backing. The other ones had no historical or anything to do with Islam. So we were outrun. We were outnumbered. There would be about 10 ladders, Muslim ladders. We had maybe 1 Christian ladder in the afternoons. That's completely changed now. And these conferences that we're having now in London every summer, suddenly we have 120 to 200 to now 300 people showing up at these conferences just on polemics. The word polemics wasn't even known back in the 1990s. Pretty much I was the one that had to introduce it to the churches, because we just didn't have anybody doing polemics at all in Britain and in Europe. A few maybe in America, but now with the internet has just blown this wide open. Are you going to speak about that now, or are you going to say something? Would this be a good chance to bring that in? Because much of what GodLogic does, he immediately films. Much of what those of us like Bob the Builder and what you do, Bob from Speaker's Corner and you do, you put immediately up on the internet so it goes worldwide. Can you say something that, or are you going to bring that in?
Yeah, I'll say something about it now. So you've obviously been this a lot longer than I have, so it's probably more profound to you than it is to me. But for the 3 odd years that I've been doing this, I have seen a massive growth in the amount of talented, well-spoken Christian apologists who, they're not just doing apologetics, they're not just making a defense for the faith, but they're out there and they know Islam. And they know Islam to a very high level. And they're bringing arguments that are airtight and they've been well practiced. And they're bringing them like a bulldozer. And Muslims don't want to engage. It's getting to the point where, in effect, these people are blacklisted by Muslim debaters. Muslim debaters just don't. And it started off with a few people. Bob was blacklisted because he's very good at what he does. Mm-hmm. And then that went to others. It went to Paperboy. It went to me as well. It went to David, who's another amazing speaker at Speaker's Corner. And it's continuing. And this is kind of what I mean by this intellectual fatigue. There just isn't this desire to engage anymore, and it isn't worth it. We come across better in the videos, as in our arguments look better compared to their arguments, and they know this. And it's interesting because many Muslims are hungry for this. They watch all the videos on the Dawah channels, but they're not satisfied with the content.
Yeah, they
want more. They're like, "Hey, Dai, can you please, explain this to me?" And you can watch their live streams. They do live streams where they try and help Muslims with their doubts. And Muslims keep joining and they keep saying, look, I have serious doubts. I've watched this and this video. I saw this and this. I've heard about this in the Quran or the Hadith, and I don't know what to do about it because I just don't have an answer. And the Muslims are getting frustrated because they don't want to engage with it. And it becomes very, very evident. But yeah, the amount of growth in the amount of polemics that's happening at Speaker's Corner and also online, especially online, is absolutely amazing. And it's gotten to the point now where the last time I went to Speaker's Corner, I looked around at all the different conversations that were going on, and I was absolutely amazed with how everyone was engaging. Not a single person was struggling, not a single Christian I thought I could jump in to help them out. Everyone was standing their own. Everyone knew what to say, and all speaking in unison. And there's just no coherent response from the Muslims. And it was amazing to see. I thought, wow, we've come a long way in just 3 years' time. And that's from my perspective. I imagine from yours, it's even more so. But
Yeah, no,
yes.
it's just been a joy when I was up there, and I was saying this just earlier today when we went out for dinner, all of us afterwards, about 120 of us. I just looked around the room, and I just said to my group that were there, I said, look at all these guys and gals. They're all half my age. Look at every one of them is able to engage with Islam, with these Muslims on so many different areas, both internally, both externally, both culturally. And I said, this is the legacy that we're passing on. Look at this next generation coming up. They're faster, they're quicker, they know the material better. And the baton we're passing on, because we're getting old. Those of us who are in the room, they're looking at the others. I got gray hair. We're not going to be doing this much longer. But what you guys, you young guys, are doing now, I mean, I almost had tears in my eyes. I said, this is the legacy, because the gospel is so strong. And because we've had all these questions, basically, we're just taking the same questions that have been thrown at us and we're just throwing them back at them. And there's just no response to this. This intellectual paucity within Islam is so evident now, because now they have to deal with it because there's cameras on them, and this is immediately going up into the internet, so people have to watch it, and you can see why they're walking away. Like you have the example of Ali Dawah having to walk away from God Logic.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there's a lot of people who don't do dawah, but they record dawah and they upload it to their own YouTube channels, and they of course get views from this. A lot of Muslims are very hungry to have their faith defended, because that to me demonstrates a need for dawah because they're struggling.
Yeah.
And it also tells me that they record even debates that go badly for Muslims, which is almost all of them now. But they still record it and they still upload it because it benefits them. So there's a really nice kind of network in place where Muslims will still record bad debates because it benefits them. They make a living from this. So the only people that can really stop this is the Muslim debaters themselves. And that's what we see. We see them telling the cameramen, no, don't record this. Don't upload this. So yeah, it's really interesting how this is played out. Cool. So this is kind of leading into what I was saying here. Dawah, that is evangelism from Muslims to non-Muslims, is kind of changed in how it's done. It used to be done, the primary focus that you can bring individuals into Islam, and it would be through educating them on Islam, explaining what Islam is, the 5 pillars, explaining the Quran, explaining Muhammad, explaining the biographical life of Muhammad, and these kind of things. But it changed rapidly with the invention of social media. We now have a different emphasis, which is on content creation as a money-making enterprise. And many cameramen, many people who record the dawah, who they themselves are Muslim, they 100% support these da'is. They do it because it's financially profitable to do so. And that leads to them recording things that actually aren't particularly useful for Muslims watching at home. It doesn't really answer their questions, but nonetheless, it gets a lot of views. So that's also quite an interesting fact. You can combine this with the amount of political activism. A lot of dawah is being preoccupied with issues regarding Gaza, Palestine, Israel. A lot of political emphasis creeps into dawah. So it tends to take on political forms as well, depending on what's happening elsewhere in the world. Mostly, again, because it's a popular topic. And if it's a popular topic, it gets a lot of views, which means the people who record it and the people who speak about it profit from that in some way.
But just back to that real quickly. Are you suggesting then that because the theology, they're just being destroyed theologically and philosophically and intellectually, they're moving into the political sphere because that's just one of the area that they feel they can engage, particularly with the whole thing with Gaza. Gaza has been a real boon for them, and that's why they are, especially in Europe and especially in Britain, and so that's why that's the one thing that they think they can still grab and hold on to.
Yes, there's definitely a big element of that. It's a lot easier to talk about Gaza than it is to talk about Islam. That's now become a reality. I mean, what happens now is because, again, there's an emphasis on social media and getting those views, unsuspecting members of the public are invited to dawah stalls, and I've included a nice little picture if you bring the presentation back up here. of this guy who's a guy who gives dawah. I seriously doubt he would actually talk to me or any of the other Christians. In fact, I know he doesn't talk to other Christians, but he's giving dawah to this young lady. And what I'm trying to convey here is the emphasis is on trying to get members of the public to say the Shahada or to say something positive about Islam. Because by doing so, it reassures other Muslims that dawah is successful. Even if this particular person doesn't become a Muslim, even if this person says the Shahada without really knowing what they're doing and then goes home and never thinks anything more of it, that's largely irrelevant. What matters is that the perception in Western nations in particular is positive. Dawah needs to be seen as being successful. It needs to be seen as working. When in reality, it's not. It's a very difficult enterprise for those who engage in it. And often when people do actually become Muslim, they leave very, very quickly, very early on.
So what you're saying is these are false converts then?
A lot of them, yeah. I mean, to be honest with you, yeah, I mean, they're not even converts in any sense for the most part. A lot of them are just... So there's a tendency, and you probably have picked up on this, Jay, as well. In Britain, we like to be very polite, right? So when we're invited to talk to someone, even if we don't actually agree with what they're saying and we have no interest in what they're saying, a lot of people will just smile, nod politely, and go along with what they're doing because they just feel like they're being good, right? It's just a nice thing to do. And a lot of that tends to be taken advantage of by da'is who then run through scripts. They say, hey, let me tell you about Muhammad. They give this usually quite lengthy script, and they end it with, now, do you agree there's one God? Or do you agree there could be a God? And they'll probably say, yeah, maybe, yeah. And they'll say, well, you know, if you wanted to be a Muslim, all you need to do is say these words. And they'll say, what words? And they'll say, now repeat after me. And then they'll say in Arabic, the Shahada, the declaration of faith. And a lot of the time, they'll just repeat it because it's intriguing to them. And they don't really realize what they're doing. But of course, as soon as this happens, the cameras stop recording. They say goodbye, and the person goes home, and they don't think anything more of it. They don't think they're now a Muslim. They just think they've been very very British. But yeah, it's all there for content creation. And I want to go into this because this is quite profound as well, both in terms of how often this happens. So I've mentioned before, we've had something that's been termed the avalanche of apostasy. Many Muslims and many converts to Islam are leaving Islam at a very alarming rate. This is acknowledged by both Muslims and non-Muslims, as well as the data that backs it up as well. But what's interesting is that the people who represent Islam, the people who are the spokespeople for Islam, have openly let the floodgates, they've opened the floodgates and they've let everything through, because they have publicly declared that what ought to happen to people who leave Islam is that they ought to be killed. If a caliph is ever established, that would be the appropriate Islamic punishment. And people like Ali Dawah even have a video of this on YouTube that is still there on YouTube, of him declaring that he is proud that this will eventually happen to particular ex-Muslims. And this is, from a non-Muslim perspective, very eye-opening, because once you know this, a lot of people are turned off by this, and they say, I don't want to become a Muslim, because if I ever decide it's not for me, then I'm going to have people telling me that I ought to be killed. Even if they can't actually do it, there's this looming shadow of, if these people ever got some kind of power, they would come after me. And I'd rather not make that many enemies when I don't really have to. And I also want to bring this up as well. I want to talk about the geography of the UK, and we'll look at it based on the 2021 census data. Many people have a misconception of the UK as being highly Islamic. There's been a lot of Islamic immigration. There's large communities of Muslims in London and other major cities. And they kind of extrapolate that to think, well, that must mean most of England, most of Wales, most of Scotland and Ireland have in some way been affected by Islam. And that's just not the case. So while there has been significant immigration to cities and towns across the UK, for the most part, most areas, the more rural areas, have been completely unaffected in any sense. And you can actually see this image on the right-hand side here. Most parts of England, and particularly Wales, don't even have any Muslims living there. There's just near to 0% Muslim population in these rural areas. Most of the UK has no influence at all by Islam. Completely not even affected minorly. For example, where I live and where other people live that I know who live in rural areas, there is no nearby mosque. There simply isn't one to go. So if someone were a Muslim who lived in these areas, they would have a difficult time forming communities because there simply isn't a place to gather, nor are there many people to gather with. So again, this is just a way of showing that although cities have been affected, and yes, they've been affected significantly, the vast majority of the nation hasn't actually, in terms of geography anyway, hasn't actually been affected by Islam at all. I would argue because most people don't find it influential. Most people aren't convinced by the message of Islam. They consider it very foreign. They don't agree with the moral application of Islam. They don't agree with the historic understanding of Islam. Many people are aware that Christians have fought off Islamic invasion for centuries, and many people don't particularly find it attractive. And that's why you don't see any kind of natural spread of Islam. It is purely driven by immigration to large areas of cities, and from that point onwards, surviving basically just through birth rates and more immigration.
Could I just say also, possibly it may have something to do with the fact that most Muslims go to not rural areas, but to urban areas. And it's only in the urban areas. If you look at that map there, it's really, those are all urban areas that you have there. Like there's quite a bit in the north. Those are the industrial belt that's up there in the north, and then there's a lot there's Birmingham, and then coming down to London in the southeast. That's where over 1 million Muslims are just in that one city alone.
It's unable to spread outwards. We just don't see any kind of spread outside these large cities, and that to me indicates a failure of conversion. People in outside these cities are not interested in Islam for the most part. And I've listed some sources here from where I got this information from, and you can scan here to get the presentation. And this is me, Chris the Speaker's Corner. If you want to hear more content like this, you can go find me here on YouTube. And that's it. That's my presentation. We can talk more about certain things that I haven't mentioned in this presentation, particularly to do with economic concerns and how this has an impact on fertility rates, as well as higher education. But yeah.
Well, listen, this is excellent. Let me just do a quick overview of what you have talked about. Why is Islam collapsing? And you talk about the fact that most people believe, and this is mentioned all the time by Muslims, it is the fastest growing religion on earth. And in many statistics, that would bear that out. But almost all of it is what we call biological growth. They just have larger families. What they're not saying is what happens to many of these who are being born in these families. Many of them, you're saying that 24% of the youth have left Islam. And these are their statistics. These bear out that this is a real problem, and the Muslims haven't really contended with this. And then you're saying that there's also a real problem within the convert community. There is a hierarchy within the convert community. A lot of it has to do with celebrities and people of influence. They are given much more airtime. They're given a lot more attention. Those who don't really have much to offer, all they want is the shahada. They want that statistic to put out there, and then they don't pay much attention to them. But if you're white, if you're part of the larger culture, which is mostly white in England, then they give much more time to you, because the understanding is, and they don't even try to hide this, that we need to influence the larger community. Therefore, let's spend more time and energy on those from that community. So you have this hierarchy, which causes an awful lot of dissension amongst those who are not part of the majority population. And then you go into the decline, population decline. Those graphs were amazing because those are outside of Britain. That's outside of the West. You're showing population declines in these countries where majority Muslim countries, that's just plummeting from anywhere from 7 to 8 to 9 children, going all the way down to 3, in some cases even 2 children on an average for Muslim populations. They're almost coming down to the same level that Europeans and Western nations have, and that's has to do an awful lot with industrialization. I'm sure that has an awful lot to do with higher education, and people are with a much growing or much stronger and bigger middle class that's coming to many of these countries. With that comes also the nuclear family, not so much the extended family structures tend to fall back. You want to come back to me on any of this?
Yeah, just to add a little bit more as well. So I gave the statistics for other nations that are predominantly Muslim, but there are statistics as well that we have in the UK of predominantly predominant. Actually, is probably a strong word. I mean areas where there is a substantial Muslim population. So Tower Hamlets has the highest concentration of Muslims in a single area. It's about 40% of Tower Hamlets is now Muslim. Tower Hamlets is a particular borough in London, here in the UK. They, if you look at the fertility rate of Tower Hamlets, it's plummeting again. It's going down. Which again is the trend, not just in the UK but across the world. So you would have thought that if Muslims are unaffected by this, having 40% of an area be Muslim would in some way help this, because Muslims theoretically are having bigger families. But that's not what the statistics are showing. They are also being affected by it as well. Not only this, but I mean, one cause you could argue, and academics say it's largely because of economic uncertainty. That affects me, it affects you, Jay, it affects Muslims as well, just as equal. They have to decide whether or not they're still going to have a job next year. So should they have children, or should they have more children? Not only that, but higher education is something that, interestingly, many Muslims actually outperform the native British population with. So, for example, the statistic is, I think, between 6 to 8% of non-Muslim British 18-year-olds go into university, 6 to 8%. But with the Muslim population, it's closer to 11%. So they're actually outperforming us on that. Now, it's interesting because they don't perform so well in terms of the grades compared to non-Muslims. But within these 11%, there is a trend of the majority of those who go to university who are Muslim to be women, which is interesting because that also is in line with the trend ever since the 90s in the West of women going into higher education at higher rates compared to men. So if this rate continues, which I have no reason to think it won't, we will likely see Muslims going more and more into higher education, affecting their level of fertility rates. Academics have long pointed at these two metrics: economic uncertainty and higher learning, higher education, as being two of the main factors that influence a woman's decision in having children.
No.
So that seems to also be happening to the Muslim communities as well.
Which makes sense, Chris, because that's where, going into the next area you brought up, the whole liberal influence, that's where they will get that liberal influence. They'll get it to some extent in their schooling at a younger age, but with the real liberal influence comes in university, at the higher education. And that is the idea that you have to mix with other sexes. You have no other choice. And that becomes almost natural for them. And many who go home on vacation, they see this as a problem that there is, especially for women, they see this as a problem because they're treated as equals in university, not so when they get back home. I was fascinating. You brought up the halal meat, the whole thing. Some of the idea, I didn't really think of this as being a problem, a liberal influence, but you're right. The fact that many of the abattoirs are just using recorded shahadas or the bismillahs. I can understand then why Muslims are upset, because that's not even though it may be a recording of a natural Muslim doing this, you could see how that could be easily be taken over and create enormous amount of controversy. The immoral convert Muslim influences. Mike Tyson, when he became a Muslim, they were ballyhooing at how great this was until a few months later when he started using a lot of profane language and foul language and playing around with women. This caused then a huge embarrassment. And so some of these converts, many of them are sportsmen, and many of them are celebrities in movies and all the rest. You can see they don't know what they have tied into. They don't know what they have promised themselves into. And there is this initial attraction of becoming a Muslim. But once you become a Muslim, then you can see how it then obviates. You can see that they see what that is called of them. They don't want to change their lifestyle. It's too difficult. I remember having a large discussion here, not too far from where I live, with an imam who is an Afro-American imam. And he said, they have a real success rate of converts in prison. And the reason why is because they get protection there and they're given a lot of privileges that others are not given. But once they leave prison, they fall away. They don't see them any longer. And a lot of the reason is because they go back to their same lifestyle that they had before. They don't need Islam anymore once they leave prison. And he was really upset. He didn't know what to do with it. I said, well, you might want to help them understand how to live in a very immoral life. And this whole liberal ethos that is becoming rampant all over the Western Muslims don't know how to deal with that. I thought it was fascinating, the whole criticism of Islam that is really taken, and you're right, the whole idea of polemics. We've never known polemics before. It's something we're just introducing. And as a result of that, Muslims don't know how to deal with this polemics. How could they? They've never really had. They live in a cocoon for so many years, almost centuries. They've had a cocoon where they've not really had any critical analysis of their scriptures or of their prophet or of their history, to say nothing of their theology and, of course, their philosophy, the undergirdings of Islam. You can see why that is causing a huge amount of what do I want to say? Looking back and for the first time having to assess really what their foundations are, which is creating a fatigue. This intellectual fatigue. I love that you talk about. It is an intellectual fatigue. We don't have this in Christianity. It used to be 100 years ago. There was an intellectual fatigue when the Germans started putting historical criticism at us. And of course, Darwinian, when Darwin came up with his theories, that had a huge impact on Christianity. We have now responded to that and have come up with responses to that in the last 100 years. Islam hasn't even begun to respond to that. And I don't know how they can, especially with the historical critique, since there's nothing really they can use to support that. You talk about the da'wah and the fact that they're moving away from this theological da'wah anymore because they realize it's not that attractive, moving away from the philosophical da'wah, and they're moving into a political form of da'wah. And I think that has really taken off, especially with the Palestinian issue, with the Gaza material. That has been huge in the West. I'm not so sure it's that much outside of the West, because it's only the West that's really has jumped on that bandwagon. We're not seeing this happen in places like Amman or in places like Riyadh or Jeddah, and also the other major places in the Middle East. So da'wah, you can see they've had to change their whole tune on this. And then, of course, you talk about the apostasy, this floodgate of apostasy. Now, I would suggest there's a floodgate of apostasy because of all these other reasons that you've just brought in. I mean, you add up every one of these, the liberal influences, the problem with the hierarchy within the convert community, the criticism that's now they're being flailed with, the intellectual fatigue, that's causing an enormous amount of apostasy. And it was helped by people like Ali Dawah making that pronouncement that when they come in power, they're going to kill any of the apostates. Whoa. You can see then why they're going the other direction. And then, of course, you're saying that we need to be careful about overblowing what Islam is doing in the West, and especially you gave that graph of Britain, where you're saying, really, folks, let's be careful. Let's don't get all bent out of shape. Islam is not that much of impact. You didn't talk about the grooming gangs, which we're finding out is almost entirely Muslim, mostly Muslim, and that there's an awful lot of scriptural support. I don't know if you've heard this new survey that's just come out, put out by Dr. Mark Dury. I don't know if you've seen that article. We're going to be doing a video on it tomorrow. But it's showing that this support for the grooming gang, it's not just only in Britain, it's in almost every major country where Muslims are represented. And it can almost entirely be supported by scripture and by the theology and the philosophy of Islam. But that's for another thing. But the grooming gang hasn't really been blown open yet, because there has been a quashing of that. However, that also must have had some impact on people who become Muslims, or people who have a view of Islam, if that is so endemic to their scriptures and, of course, their philosophy. Listen, Chris, this has been great. We do need to bring this to a conclusion. Is there any last things you'd like to say?
Yeah, I'd just like to reiterate that this isn't a way of kind of downplaying our role in this. Like, you know, we don't need to do anything. Islam is collapsing in and of itself. No, we still need to ride the waves, so to speak. We need to continue the momentum. We need to continue pressing Islam, to press the da'is, to dominate the social media spaces, to make content that not only attacks Islam polemically, but also gives the message of the gospel as an alternative, to say, hey, this is better. This is the good life, to follow our Lord Jesus Christ and not Muhammad as you find him in the Quran and the Hadith. And yeah, I think this has been a great chat. I think there's much more that could be said about this. You're right about the grooming gangs. That's obviously a whole topic in and of itself. What you could say about that.
I would call that as another chapter, the whole moral problem with Islam.
Yes, the culture shock. There's the ancestors of people who were born in Britain. Most of them, if you go far back enough, were Christian. And we've obviously embodied that even with the secular aspect of society. They're still fundamentally acting in a Christian moral framework. To be a Muslim requires you to not really just reject that, but to flip it on its head. And, you know, instead of loving your neighbor, you need to probably have some kind of resentment towards certain people. God doesn't really love everyone. He doesn't love the kafir, the unbelievers. You know, in a lot of these things, when Muslims realize that this is what they're being asked of, it's just not something they can really embrace. It goes against not only what they believe, but their parents, their siblings, their grandparents, you know, and they just can't pay that price. So they choose to leave Islam.
Chris, thank you so much. This has been excellent. Now, folks, you are listening to what Chris is saying. I'm sure you have some response. You have the comments right here at the bottom. Do write your comments. Chris is going to be looking at them. I'm going to be looking at them. It may be that we may need to do a second video to take on this one, because this is a subject that not many people have talked about. This is something you're bringing up, noticing that you're using an awful lot of statistics. We are looking at the statistics and coming to some conclusion that some of you may not agree with. Let us know. Let us know what you get back at us, and let us see what you're saying. But certainly Islam does have a problem, and it is having an increasing problem now that it's moving to the West. And as it gets the influences of the West, which you're right, it's a Christian memory. I call it a Christian memory that's still here in the West, very much so all across Europe and here in the United States as well. God bless you, Chris. This has been fun. This has been fine.
God bless you, Jay.
Until next time.
Thank you for having me.
Jay and Chris, over and out.